Combining power with speed and maneuverability, the frigate was the most versatile warship in the age of sail. Through the 18th and early 19th centuries, frigates prowled the seas, acting as the eyes of the fleet for the navies they served. They were equally important as a source of both intimidation and protection for the merchant ships that were the lifeblood of maritime trade. And when engaged in battle, frigates could be devastating. Among the most powerful sailing frigates ever constructed were those designed by American Joshua Humphreys in the late 18th century. A classic of this type was the 44-gun USS Constitution. 204 feet long, 43.5 feet wide, and displacing nearly 1,600 tons. She was significantly larger than frigates in other navies. Yet with her fine lines and over 42,000 square feet of sail, the Constitution could turn deftly on the ocean waves and reach speeds of up to 14 knots. The courageous men who served on these vessels were as important as the ships themselves, winning fame and their country's glory while providing some of the most stirring moments in naval history. Roaming like lone wolves over the oceans, frigates became one of the most widely used warships of all time. Swift, well-armed and self-sufficient, they were ideally suited for independent action. They could remain at sea for up to 6 months at a time, sailing vast distances in relatively short periods. All of these assets helped make the frigate an invaluable scouting ship in the world's navies, earning it the nickname, the Eyes of the Fleet.
Every fleet needs its eyes. It needs its scouts, especially in those days. No radar, no telephone. So how is an admiral to know where his enemy is? Now, he doesn't want to split his fleet up. He needs them together in the fleet. But he needs things light and fast to go out and search all round ahead of the fleet. So he wants light, fast scouts. And that is your frigate.
Frigates were just as valuable when serving as support vessels for the massive ships of the line that were the core of a sailing navy's striking power. They performed numerous other missions as well, from escorting friendly merchant ships in hostile waters to attacking enemy vessels in times of war. Yet despite its wide usage, the origins of the frigate are somewhat mysterious. Even the source of its name is cloaked in obscurity. Many experts believe that the Spanish were the first to coin the term fragata in the 16th century.
The Spaniards really brought it into use for the ships which they used to supply their colonies in America. It's a sort of a convenient word which gets attached to ships of a basically speedy, light construction used in various purposes.
These early ancestors of the frigate mounted oars in addition to sails to ensure their mobility, even if there was no wind. By the mid-16th century, warships very similar in structure were being built in England. In 1586, a famous English shipwright named Matthew Baker made a revolutionary drawing that illustrated the distinctive features of these swift and maneuverable vessels, which were also the basis for the legendary race-built galleons that helped defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588.
What Matthew Baker has done is to think of the analogy between the most efficient hull shape and the most efficient shape that he knew in nature. So the point in a way is theological, and that is the shape of a mackerel. This really is what people would have called a frigate. And the remarkable thing about her is just how little of her there is above the waterline. And she's essentially got one major row of guns. She's also got row ports there, there, there. So you can see the transition. So she has guns on the main deck, and then she has row ports, so she can still be propelled by oars above them.
By the early 17th century, Northern European sea raiders were employing a sleeker and swifter version of this craft for attacking their adversaries' merchant ships in the North Atlantic. the British Royal Navy had yet to evolve into the great force it would become. And during the English Civil War of 1642-48, British ships were a frequent target of these marauding predators.
They were long, narrow, lightly armed, highly maneuverable, and fast vessels. Because they caused so much difficulty during the Civil War, when the war ended, the Admiralty began ordering large numbers of these frigates to be built to serve in the British Navy.
Constructed under the central authority of the British Admiralty, which was the British Navy's high command, these early English frigates could be up to 100 feet long. Like earlier frigates, they usually had 3 masts and mounted their guns on a single deck. But their designers had begun to reconsider the idea of using both sails and oars to propel the ship.
The next development is a radical simplification. It's getting rid of oars, realizing that oars are not a practical thing, partly because of the number of men required to actually operate the huge sweeps that were necessary to pull along a 100-foot vessel.
By the beginning of the 18th century, most of the frigates employed by the British, Spanish, and French had grown to include 2 covered gun decks mounting anywhere from 24 to 50 guns. But by the middle of the century, the design evolved once again, when the second covered gun deck was removed because it made the ships too clumsy.
At that point, it was realized that a ship with 1 row of guns could be made relatively long, carry a significant amount of firepower, and still be maneuverable. And this allowed a very powerful armament to be carried on a very nimble ship.
Standardized by the French, it was this model, with a single covered gun deck and a crew of between 250 and 300 men, that became the classic frigate of the age.
It was really the French who came up with the idea of what we call the true frigate in the 1740s, and the British copied that because they found that, suddenly the enemy, the principal enemy, was using these very speedy, maneuverable, independent ships, which, although they only had guns on a single deck, were extremely effective.
Though similar, there were significant differences between English and French frigates, differences that were dictated by the contrasting battle tactics of the 2 rival nations, who were frequently at war during the 18th century. The English preferred more durable and heavily armed ships that were best suited to fight at close range. The French, on the other hand, emphasized speed and agility, designing their frigates to wage battles of maneuver. However, as with all frigates at the time, both British and French frigates were rated by their firepower. A 38-gun, 18-pounder frigate like the British Guerrière meant that the ship carried 38 guns that fired 18-pound cannonballs as her main armament.
They were continually trying to find the right weight of armament, and this is why you get this whole range of ships. You get, the 32-gun frigate armed with 12-pounder guns. You get the 32-gun frigate armed with 18-pounder guns. Then you go up to a 36-gun frigate, and then you go and it's absolutely wonderful for the ship buffs, because they are simply debating the merits of these things to this day.
Despite these classifications, however, it was not unusual for a frigate to be outfitted with more guns than she was designed for, in an effort to maximize her fighting power. As the armament of a frigate increased, so did its size. Some frigates in the late 18th century reached 150 feet in length, making them nearly as long as the primary battleship of the period, the mighty ship of the line. But although they were powerful raiding and scouting vessels, frigates were never intended to fight alongside the more massive ships of the line in the main battle fleet. Built to carry as many guns as possible, the largest ships of the line mounted over 100 cannon, 3 times as many as a standard frigate, and at a displacement of 3,500 tons, outweighed the smaller ships by a margin of up to 4 to 1. Nevertheless, frigates did perform valuable service during clashes between main battle fleets. When the opposing ships of the line arrayed themselves in the single-file rows that were the standard battle formations of the age, frigates took their place on the perimeter, out of the line of fire. From there, they used their speed to dart in among the thunderous barrages, rescuing sailors from sinking vessels or towing damaged ships of the line out of harm's way. But perhaps their most important responsibility was to relay flag messages from the fleet commander to the other ships in the battle line, whose captains often could not see their leader's signals because the billowing sails of the ships leading or following them blocked their view.
If you've got a fleet which is moving in the same direction, you can't actually see the signals of the vessel in front or behind you. You've got to have somebody out to one side. Hence the importance of repeating frigates. They were the vessels which could act as repeating vessels, sending messages back from one end of the line of battle to another.
Yet for all their valuable service in the well-known fleet actions of the 18th century, the versatile and independent frigates still spent most of their time alone, scouting and raiding on the wide open sea. It was a sea which provided great opportunities for the daring captains of the frigates. When frigates were sailing and fighting on their own, with neither the support of a squadron nor the supervision of a commanding admiral, the frigate captain reigned supreme. He had to employ all of his personal resources, his navigational skills, his seamanship, and his survival instincts to ensure the success and safety of his ship and its crew. Only the bravest and most daring men could succeed with such a responsibility. This made frigates an excellent proving ground for ambitious young officers, many of whom received their first command on a frigate.
So it was a young man's job, frigates. Again, your immortal years when you're young. You believe you're indestructible. This would be the ship. You were bound to get a certain amount of independence because you were off scouting. This would be the thing that every young man would long to command. Wonderful thing. Perfect. The harmony of the rigging, the hull, the speed, the armament, the speed to get out of the way of the ship aligned, the armament to take on anything your own size anywhere in the world with confidence. Oh, must have been a wonderful job being a frigate captain.
One of the most audacious frigate commanders was British Captain Michael Seymour. Joining the ranks of the Royal Navy at the age of 12, Seymour made lieutenant at the age of 22 and lost an arm in battle 2 years later while commanding a frigate. In November 1808, while England was at war with France, Seymour and his crew aboard the 36-gun frigate HMS Amethyst gave chase to the 40-gun French frigate Thetis off the French coast. Seymour did not know that in addition to her usual crew, the Thetis was carrying some 100 additional soldiers to an overseas base. As Seymour drew within range, he gave the command to fire. The two ships exchanged a fierce barrage of broadsides and musketry for the next 2 hours. Finally, with her sails blasted full of holes and one of her masts shot away, the Thetis surrendered. Although the French frigate had begun the battle with a nearly 2-to-1 manpower advantage, 135 of her men were killed, including her captain, and 102 more wounded. Captain Seymour in the Amethyst had lost 19 men, with 51 wounded out of a crew of 261. For his success, Seymour was given the British Naval Medal, a rare honor at the time for a frigate captain. However, medals were not the only thing that could be won by a frigate captain who had done well in battle. They could also receive monetary rewards. Called prize money, it meant that if a ship was captured or taken as a prize, the value of it and its cargo was shared by the crew of the capturing vessel. The potential to earn prize money was a tremendous incentive for the sailors aboard all warships. But because frigates often operated against merchant ships carrying valuable cargo, the opportunities to win prize money aboard a frigate were greater than on any other type of ship.
Prize money was, of course, the way you encouraged everyone. If a ship fought, say, a French ship and captured it, and that ship was considered to be a good one, it would be bought by the Admiralty, and the money would be shared amongst the captain and the crew. So if you wanted to make a lot of prize money, you had to decide what the best thing to be in. Now, if you're in a frigate, you've got the speed, the agility to go and capture other ships with greater ease, merchant ships in particular. And therefore, your chances of making prize money were really quite good.
After determining a ship's worth and taking a percentage itself, The court would then divide the rest of the prize money. The captain of the victorious ship received the greatest share, 3/8. The remaining 5/8 were apportioned among his officers and crew according to court specifications.
The captain got the lion's share. Well, of course, he had the responsibility, and he directed the fight, and so I suppose you could say he deserved it. But all hands participated. Even the lowliest ship's boy got his cut. It was small, but in his terms, it was big money.
The court guidelines determined not only how the money was distributed, but also whether or not the captain and his crew had taken the prize legitimately.
They weren't allowed to go and start a war on their own, for example. They weren't allowed to go and prey on neutral shipping. They could only prey on the shipping of the enemy. And if you broke those rules, well, your career probably came to a fairly abrupt halt.
When the court upheld a prize, however, the frigate captain stood to win astounding riches. In one famous incident in 1799, 4 British frigates captured 2 Spanish ships carrying loads of gold and silver. When the prize money was distributed, each of the 4 English frigate captains received a staggering £40,000. Since a frigate captain's salary at the time was just over £100 a year, each man had earned approximately 400 years' pay in less than a day. It was easy to understand why some frigate captains ignored opportunities to command larger ships in the fleet, preferring to remain in the potentially more lucrative frigates for their entire careers. Ironically, a similar pursuit of plunder on the vital waterways of the sea inspired the birth of what would become the world's next great naval power, a power that built its foundation on a new generation of super frigates. The United States Navy can, for the most part, attribute its beginnings to piracy. By the end of the 18th century, the Barbary Corsairs, a loose collection of marauders from the North African countries of Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, had begun regularly preying on American merchant ships in the Mediterranean Sea. But the new nation of America lacked a navy to protect itself from these attacks.
In 1783, the American people celebrated independence. What they didn't celebrate and didn't understand is that while they had gained independence, they had also lost something. They lost membership in the British Empire. And by losing membership in the British Empire, we lost the protection of the Royal Navy. So American vessels at sea became fair game for almost anyone who wanted to prey upon us.
Despite recurring assaults by the Barbary Corsairs, it wasn't until 1794 that the U.S. Congress responded to public pressure and authorized the creation of a navy. It decided to build 6 new frigates.
Frigates were desired because they were something of a compromise. They knew that building smaller vessels, such as brigs or sloops, simply would not do the job. They would be too small for the exercise of power in the Mediterranean. On the other hand, we could not build ships of the line. Ships of the line are enormously expensive to construct, and they consume tremendous manpower.
Although they were less expensive than ships of the line, the new frigates were still the largest defense expenditure yet for the U.S. government. Congress allocated the then enormous sum of almost $700,000 for the work. With so much at stake, someone with skill and experience was needed to oversee the task. That man was Philadelphia ship designer Joshua Humphreys.
Humphreys was chosen because he was a well-known Philadelphia shipbuilder, had a very high reputation, had been building vessels in Philadelphia for many, many years.
Humphreys' goal was to design frigates that combined the strength and durability of British warships with the swiftness and agility favored by the French. In addition, he intended their main armament to be 44 guns, 30 of which fired 24-pound cannonballs, significantly more firepower than carried by standard European frigates. But the extra armament would create extra weight, which could not only weaken the ship's structure, but potentially make it slower and clumsier as well.
When you had a ship of war and you had these 1 or more gun decks lined with guns, they went as far forward and as far aft as possible, putting huge weights at the extreme ends of the ship, which meant it had a natural tendency to droop at each end.
These downward forces put extraordinary stress on the keel an enormous piece of timber running lengthwise along the bottom of the ship that served as its structural backbone.
This was called hogging, I suppose because the resultant shape of the keel was sort of like a hog's back. Now, hogging in its severest form would cause the ship to break its back. In lesser terms, it caused maneuvering problems, stability problems. It was a bad thing, pure and simple. Now, what Humphreys did was he put in a series of vertical members between decks to distribute the weight from the gun deck down more evenly to the next deck called the berth deck. And below the berth deck, down in the hold, leading from the underside of the berth deck, were a series of diagonals that then directed this force toward the center of where this bending would occur, and had those diagonals meet one another there so they were pressing on each other, like isometric exercises. This is one of the diagonal riders I mentioned a moment ago, Joshua Humphreys' unique contribution to naval architecture. There are 3 pairs of these coming down from the bow and 3 other pairs coming forward from the stern. They sweep along the curve of the hull until they finally meet at the keelson. There, the opposing forces cancel one another out and eliminate the problem of hogging. This unique structure was present in all American major sailing warships until the end of the age of fighting sail.
By solving the problem of hogging, Humphreys' brilliant innovations gave his new ships the structural strength to be made larger and more powerful than any frigates afloat, while still having the sleek, stable hulls necessary for great speed and maneuverability. The results were vessels that could outsail and outfight any other frigates in the world.
When the design for the American frigates, what they really put forth was not your ordinary run-of-the-mill conventional frigate. These were really super frigates.
In 1797, the first 2 of Joshua Humphreys' new super frigates were launched: the United States in Philadelphia and the USS Constitution in Boston. Yet before this occurred, the U.S. government decided to pay tribute money to the Barbary corsairs in exchange for a guarantee that they would no longer interfere with American trade in the Mediterranean. To some, it appeared that the new ships had been built for nothing. But a different threat soon emerged. In 1798, with France involved in a war with England, French warships began seizing American vessels.
France had been our ally in the American Revolution. She had helped us achieve independence. But then when she went to war with Great Britain, she expected us to come to her aid. We did not. We proclaimed neutrality. That proclamation of neutrality was seen by the French as a betrayal. And so the French began to harass our trade.
In the ensuing undeclared or quasi-war with France, America's new frigates quickly proved their worth. In separate engagements, the 38-gun USS Constellation defeated the French frigates L'Insurgente and Vengeance. By the end of the 2-year war, the 45 military vessels employed by the U.S. had captured 95 armed French ships. America's valiant young sailors and her even younger Navy had passed their first test.
There was no trading of territory. There were no great surrenders. Nonetheless, during that war, the American Navy had demonstrated its power to protect American commerce and to keep at sea for long periods of time.
The fledgling U.S. Navy would soon be called upon to prove its capability again. Trouble was once more brewing in the Mediterranean, where the Barbary ruler of Tripoli suddenly demanded additional tribute. With its new navy in place, the leaders of the United States now believed they had the means to contest such extortions. In June of 1801, President Thomas Jefferson dispatched a squadron led by the frigates President, Philadelphia, and Essex to the Mediterranean as a show of force. Yet despite the U.S. presence and a subsequent naval blockade of Tripoli, the corsairs remained defiant, actually increasing their tribute demands. As the undeclared war continued into October of 1803, trouble struck for the U.S. Navy when the Philadelphia, under the command of William Bainbridge, ran aground on an uncharted reef off Tripoli. The enemy swarmed on board and took almost 400 sailors hostage, including Bainbridge himself. In addition to the corsairs' ransom demand of $3 million, the U.S. government had to face the fact that the Tripolitans now possessed a mighty American frigate to reinforce their fleet of smaller vessels. It was not the kind of news that Edward Preble, America's newly appointed Mediterranean Squadron commander, wanted to hear.
Here now was a great threat. Something needed to be done. Philadelphia either needed to be rescued or she needed to be destroyed. Preble made the decision that it was not practical to try to rescue her out of the harbor of Tripoli, that the only alternative was to destroy her.
The man who played the key role in this mission was a fearless young lieutenant named Stephen Decatur. When deciding whether to wait for reinforcements or proceed immediately, Decatur brashly declared, "The fewer the number, the greater the glory." On the night of February 16, 1804, Decatur and 75 volunteers stole into Tripoli harbor aboard a small ship, the Intrepid.
She was a vessel that had been captured in the area, and so she looked like a local vessel. Intrepid made her way into the port of Tripoli, came alongside Philadelphia, and Decatur and his men rushed aboard.
The stunned Tripolitan guards either jumped overboard or were cut down in bloody hand-to-hand combat. Within minutes, the Americans had set the Philadelphia ablaze. Decatur and every one of his men escaped safely. When news of his daring raid reached the United States, Stephen Decatur became an instant hero. He was also promoted to captain. At age 25, the youngest man ever to hold that rank in the U.S. Navy. It was an accomplishment that even impressed the most legendary commander in the British Royal Navy.
It was one of the most heroic exploits in the history of the American Navy. It caught the attention not only of Commodore Preble, who promoted Stephen Decatur, but indeed even Admiral Horatio Nelson remarked on what a heroic and magnificent exploit this was by the American Navy.
Despite Decatur's heroism and Preble's relentless bombardment of Tripoli from the Constitution, one fact remained unchanged. The Corsairs still held William Bainbridge and all of his men hostage. As the conflict dragged on for another year, it began to appear doubtful whether either side would ever prevail. But finally, the U.S. blockade of Tripoli's ports that had begun in 1801 started to take its toll, and in 1805, the Corsairs significantly lowered their ransom demand. Rather than prolong the war further, the U.S. Congress accepted the offer. Although the Tripolitan War ended inconclusively, the memorable exploits of men like Stephen Decatur and the performance of U.S. frigates like the Constitution gave America's leaders the confidence to believe that they could and should protect their country's interests no matter how far from home. Not surprisingly, Admiral Nelson saw these developments in a more ominous light. Upon gazing at the Constitution on her return voyage to America, he remarked, "In the handling of those transatlantic ships lies a nucleus of trouble for the Navy of Britain." Though few would have believed it at the time, less than a decade later, Admiral Nelson's statement about the Yankee frigates would prove to be prophetic. Like the quasi-war with France, the War of 1812 between the United States and Great Britain started on the high seas. The Royal Navy had begun stopping American ships and taking U.S. sailors into its ranks by force because its manpower had been depleted by its long-running war with the French. This so-called impressment, coupled with British interference with free and neutral U.S. trade, finally convinced President James Madison and Congress that they had to take a stand. After diplomatic efforts failed to bring about a timely settlement, the United States declared war on England in June of 1812. America's tiny fleet of 17 ocean-going warships had to face what for centuries had been the greatest sea power on Earth. The Times of London scoffed at the U.S. Navy in comparison, describing it as nothing but a handful of fur-built frigates under a bit of striped bunting.
There is no other fleet in the world. Indeed, there are no other two fleets combined that can match the strength and power of the Royal Navy.
Yet early in the war, A familiar Yankee frigate sent a resounding message to the British that the U.S. Navy would not back down from the fight. On August 19, 1812, about 600 miles off the coast of Boston, the Constitution, led by Captain Isaac Hull, squared off against the British frigate Guerrière. Although outgunned by the Constitution, British Captain James Dockery shared his country's disdain for the larger American frigates, viewing them only as fatter prizes for the taking.
Guerrière was a 38-gun frigate, and so was smaller. She had a much more experienced crew. Hulls had only been together 2 months. In the initial moves, both sides thought the other was trying to seek advantage, and they basically maneuvered each other into neutrality. And finally, the Britisher lost patience, apparently, and turned downwind, which was a signal, come on alongside and let's slug it out, and Hull did.
At just after 4 p.m., the Guerrière opened fire. But Captain Hull of the Constitution held his guns in check while he maneuvered his ship closer to the enemy. Finally, at a point-blank range of barely 25 yards, the Constitution unleashed a full broadside.
And after about 20 minutes, the Britishers' aftermast was shot away. It went over the side. It caused her to lose control. She swung sharply and crashed into Constitution.
As the two ships pulled apart, Hull maneuvered the Constitution into a position where it could bring a full broadside to bear on the Guerrière's unprotected bow. The effect was devastating.
And then, for reasons we don't really understand, they collided again with Guerrière's bowsprit, the thing that sticks out in the front, catching in some of Constitution's rigging.
Both sides tried to send boarders to the attack, but the hail of musketry was so intense that neither side was successful.
And they pulled apart. Now, as they pulled apart, the bowsprit of the Guerrière whipped as it finally broke free, and it sent shockwaves up its rigging to the foremast. And the quivering of the foremast was so bad it broke. And as it started to go, its problem was transmitted to the mainmast, and it followed suit.
At just before 7 p.m., the mastless Guerrière, now little more than a shattered hulk, surrendered. Damaged too severely to be taken as a prize, she was set aflame by the Americans and sunk. Captain Hull and the inexperienced crew of the Constitution had achieved the unthinkable, defeating the British in a ship-to-ship action. When news of the victory reached America, Hull and his crew were hailed as heroes.
Here was Johnny Appleseed tweaking the nose of John Bull just as handily and easily as you please, you know, and it was a tremendous psychological boost to the United States. And it was the first in a string of frigate victories, and in that sense contributed very much to the war effort.
Yet for all their bravery and skill, it is doubtful that the men of the Constitution would have achieved victory had it not been for their ship. The more rugged structure and heavier armament of the American frigate had proven superior to the smaller British design. It was its stout construction that ultimately earned the Constitution the nickname she carries to this day.
Constitution got her nickname Ironsides when, in a battle in the War of 1812, a cannonball literally bounced off of her 21-inch thick sides. The combination of the 21 inches of wood actually was like iron, and when the cannonball hit it, it just dropped right into the sea. And a sailor saw that and said, "Huzzah, her sides are made of iron."
For the rest of the War of 1812, Ironsides and the other U.S. frigates continued to be a dominating force. William Bainbridge, who had lost the Philadelphia to the Barbary Corsairs 10 years earlier, redeemed himself by leading the Constitution to a decisive victory over the British frigate Java.
Early in the battle, a cannonball shot from Java came over the side of Constitution and took out Constitution's wheel, as well as the two sailors who were manning the wheel. At the end of the battle, Java was sinking, so the captain of the Constitution sent the Marines over to Java and took the wheel from Java and brought it over and put it on to the Constitutions.
Later in the war, under yet another captain, Charles Stewart, the Constitution triumphed over the British light frigate Cyane and the sloop of war Levant. The USS United States, commanded by Stephen Decatur, also won a smashing victory over the British frigate Macedonia. The impact of these battles sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. 13 months after the United States declared war on Great Britain, the Royal Navy issued an unprecedented order to all its frigates serving in the Atlantic Fleet.
The order is that British frigates are not to engage American frigates one-on-one. The British Admiralty feels much put upon, by the way, because all of this is terribly, terribly unfair. Because British frigates are, after all, only 38 guns, and the American frigates are much more powerful than that. So the British see the Americans as playing unfairly. When the American newspapers announce that an American frigate beat a British frigate, the British newspapers and the British Admiralty cry, "Nay, nay, nay, it was an unfair combat to begin with."
You occasionally hear the British talk about the American frigates as being cheating. Well, that's bad sportsmanship. These were very, very fine ships, excellent for the task for which they were designed. They were powerful, powerful ships, and well-ruled, well-sailed. Quite a devastating weapon of war, in fact.
Although the outcome was inconclusive when the War of 1812 ended after 3 years, one thing was certain. The fledgling American Navy had proved itself a force to be reckoned with on a global scale.
The United States ended the War of 1812 in a state of euphoria. It's not that we didn't lose naval battles or duels, but we did. But all this was forgotten. All that was remembered was what we had done to John Bull. The U.S. morale just soared. It brought together many divisive factions in the nation and really guaranteed the continued existence of the United States Navy.
It was a Navy anchored by its core of awe-inspiring frigates that was ready to expand once again to meet any challenge on the high seas. Thanks largely to the sterling performance of the Yankee frigates in the War of 1812, the U.S. government became convinced that if it were to maintain the respect America had earned as a world power, it should strengthen its Navy.
The celebrated victories of the American frigates in the War of 1812 had a tremendous effect upon the reputation of the American Navy. They gave the image of power and strength and determination, that America was a nation here that intended to stay.
In 1815, the heavy frigates Guerrière and Java, named after 2 of the British frigates defeated in the war, joined the U.S. fleet, as well as 3 74-gun ships of the line. A year later, Congress gave its approval for 9 more 74s and 12 44-gun frigates. But before construction began on the new ships, America had to deal once again with the Barbary corsairs. At the start of the War of 1812, the Barbary ruler of Algiers, Hassan Pasha, had allied himself with the British and resumed seizing American ships. During the war, the hard-pressed U.S. Navy could do nothing about these attacks. Soon as the war was over, however, President Madison dispatched Stephen Decatur and 2 squadrons of U.S. ships to the Mediterranean. Decatur, aboard the 44-gun Guerrière, promptly imposed America's terms not only on Algiers, but on Tripoli and Tunis, who had also taken American ships. The deals were proposed, as Decatur put it, at the mouth of our cannon, and quickly accepted. Never again would American ships pay a penny of tribute to the Barbary corsairs.
Decatur showed the flag, showed the force, showed the open gun ports of the American frigates, and that did the job. Simply the presence of that squadron and the size and strength of it persuades the Tripolitans that peace is more beneficial to them than war.
In an effort to ensure that the corsairs would keep their word, Decatur urged that a respectable force be left behind in the region. Shortly thereafter, the U.S. Navy formed a Mediterranean squadron anchored by 2 frigates. It was the precedent for America maintaining a naval presence abroad.
The American frigates, they certainly gave the American Republic a presence, visibility in far distant places. Their capacity to be able to sustain themselves independently and still be a significant force was vital in the record of their success.
The Yankee frigates had shown their mettle in war, peace, and armed diplomacy. helping to unite a young nation divided by regional interests and differing points of view.
The victories of those ships, the heroic actions of those captains and seamen, gave Americans something to rally behind. It gave a unity and a spirit to the Republic that might otherwise have been lacking, and we might well have been doomed to failure had we not been united as a people in celebrating the victories of these American frigates.
Despite their valiant service, life after battle was unkind to most of these remarkable ships. After their active careers ended in the early 19th century, many of the original Yankee frigates were either scrapped or burned. As for the grandest frigate of them all, the USS Constitution, time and inactivity threatened to become more formidable than any enemy ship she had ever faced.
In about 1830, the Secretary of the Navy sent an order out to all the Navy yards asking for material inspection reports on all of the ships then in reserve. What's their condition? What's it going to cost to bring them on active duty? That was it. When the order was learned here in Boston, one of the local papers got it wrong. Secretary of the Navy to scrap Constitution.
A young Bostonian, a Harvard College student by the name of Oliver Wendell Holmes, is so distressed at the thought of Constitution's disappearing that he writes a wonderful poem that, of course, has rung down through American history. I tear her tattered ensign down, long has it waved on high. It is Oliver Wendell Holmes's poem, plus public concern and outrage, that this icon, this symbol of American victory and determination, should be in threat of disappearing. And the Navy Department, of course, immediately recognizes that indeed the ship needs to be kept, and she is kept on active duty.
Never once did an enemy set foot upon her decks except as a prisoner of war. America loves this ship, and I can understand why. She's a symbol of what the country can do. She's a symbol of what the country has done.
Restored several times, Old Ironsides is moored in Boston, the place of her birth. It is now a National Historic Landmark, visited by thousands of people from all around the world.
I've seen them come from more than 100 countries in every state in the Union, and the feeling is almost uniformly euphoric. I could stand out there in the parking area by the ship and look away from her, look at the direction from which the visitors are coming, and watch them as they first catch sight of her. And you know, I don't have to look over my shoulder. I know what they're seeing. They're not just seeing Constitution. They're seeing clouds of white sails. They're seeing banks of clouds in the sky behind her, and maybe sun's rays bursting from them, and maybe even a rainbow. It's an awesome thing to watch them. She just captures the imagination incredibly. Obviously, she's captured mine.
The Constitution remains the oldest commissioned ship in the United States Navy, a permanent reminder of the grace and power of these remarkable vessels called the frigates.